It's a pleasure to be with you tonight, and also to welcome each of you who are gathered here. I'm reminded of the words of the psalmist, who said, "I was glad when they said unto me, let us go unto the house of the Lord. Let us enter into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Let us bless the Lord, and give thanks for all of the benefits that he has given unto us. Because truly we serve a great God who is merciful and gracious to all of us." My name is Alexander Campbell. I am from Bethany, West Virginia. I have not always lived in this wonderful country, the United States of America, because you see, I was born in Ireland in September of 1788. My father was Thomas Campbell. My mother was Jane Campbell. They were devout Christian people. They were members of the Presbyterian Church. They taught us children to love God and to obey the commandments of God. Not only were they devout in their relationship with the Lord, but they were dedicated to each other and dedicated to rearing the children in the right way, bringing us up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Father was also an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. I had a wonderful boyhood. Near the church where my father preached, there was a farm where we lived. And living on that farm was a wonderful place for a boy to grow up. I attended the local school, and then I was enrolled in an academy that was operated by two of my uncles. And after that, I was taught at home by my father. Because you see, Father Campbell was a highly educated man, a brilliant man. And he taught us at home. And the foundation that he gave us through instructing us at home prepared me for that time later in life when I would be able to study in the university and will be able to gain an education even as my father did. When I was a boy, I enjoyed outdoor life, as most boys do, the games that we played. Some of my favorite things were fishing and hunting. These were pastimes for me, things that I really enjoyed, but I was not too fond of studying, much to the displeasure of my father. One day, he had instructed me to study French, and I had the textbook with me, and I went out into the pasture where there was a beautiful shade tree, and I laid down under that tree and I began to study French, and soon I was asleep, and when I awoke, the milk cow had come by and had eaten my French book. My father did not take that well at all. He applied the Board of Education to the seat of learning. And he said to me, "That cow has more French in her belly than you have in your head." Well, because I was so disinterested in education, he decided to stop the training that he was giving me and assign me to work duties on the farm along with the hired laborers. I kind of enjoyed that because it served a couple of purposes. He really wanted to teach me that I needed to get an education or I would have to be doing this kind of work all my life, and I suppose he succeeded in that to a certain degree. But the real benefit was that through all of that exercise, I developed a strong, muscular body to go with the great mind that God had given me. And so I benefited greatly from that disciplinary action of my father. Having learned that lesson, I then began to apply myself to a study of the languages and the Bible. Home life was a wonderful experience with mother and father. They were strict. They were very strong in disciplinary action. They required that we all arise at an early hour in the morning. And they would assign every member of the family at least one, and sometimes 2 or 3 verses of Scripture that we were to memorize during the day. And then when we came together for the evening meal, we were to quote that passage of Scripture, and we were to explain the meaning that it had in our lives. And we did that 6 days out of the week. On the Lord's Day, we all went to church together. And when we got home, every one of us was required to tell the text that the preacher had used and to give a synopsis of the sermon. And then also to recite all of those verses that we had learned from the Bible throughout the week. And Monday, it started all over again. But from the time that I read Scriptures and the time that I learned the Scriptures, I came to believe with all of my heart that Jesus is the Son of the living God, and that it is only through the merit of his redemptive work on Calvary that there is salvation for us, and that I was a lost sinner. Even though I had been christened as a baby and brought into the fellowship of the church through all the years, I was wandering away from God, and I needed salvation. And it was not until I came to really trust in Jesus, to know that I could rely upon him for the salvation of my soul, that I began to find peace in my heart and peace in my mind. And when I had that experience, and now I felt that I was close to God, I shared that with my father, and we shared that with the church, and I was taken into the church as a full-fledged member, a new member of the congregation where my father was the minister. My father, and I have referred to him many, many times, and we knew him as Father Campbell. His name was Thomas Campbell, and he was a well-educated man. And he was a highly respected minister in the Presbyterian Church. He was powerful in his preaching. He was pious. He was fully devoted to God. And his walk with God was so great that he's one of the few men that I have known in my life that I could say they truly walked with God. Sometimes in his prayer life, he was oblivious to the passing of time, and he would pray for hours. I remember once we visited my grandfather, who was an elderly man by now, and my father led in family worship as we were there at grandfather's house. And we all got down on our knees while Father Campbell prayed. And he prayed a long time. And finally, when the prayer was over and my grandfather was able to get back upon his feet, he actually took his cane and he beat my father over the back for praying so long. The father was a very devoted man to God, but he was not good when it came to finances. He was not good in managing the affairs of the farm. And his salary was so meager that it didn't go very far in supporting the family. He had organized a school called Ridge Hill Academy. He had some students there, but what they paid was not a great deal of money either. And so Father began to feel that he was failing in his family, and this began to affect him physically and emotionally, because the children were growing up, and he felt that he could not educate us the way he was educated. He could not provide for us the things that he had had during his lifetime. And so the physician recommended a long sea voyage, to go to sea and just relax and recover his mental ability and his physical ability as well. And so he was telling me about this, and I said, well, Father, I plan to go to America someday when I'm grown. So why don't you go on to America and find a place that's suitable for the family, be our home, and later we will join you there. And so he agreed to do that. And in April of 1807, he said goodbye to family and goodbye to church and goodbye to friends, and he boarded the sailing vessel and they left for America. They arrived in New York Harbor, and he went into a section of Pennsylvania in the western part of Pennsylvania, and there he was able to find a place that he could live and be happy, and also a church was there, and they called him to be the pastor of that church. But Father was already having some problems with the hierarchy in his church, and even before we got to America to join him, he had gotten into conflict again with the presbytery. He was beginning to preach things that they did not approve of. And one Sunday, when he was preaching and preparing to serve the Lord's Supper, he had in his audience people from various branches of the Presbyterian church. Now, they were all Presbyterians, but the church at that time was divided into so many different sects that one group would not have anything to do with the other group. But here they were congregated in the audience where Father Campbell was preaching, and when it came time for them to celebrate the Lord's Supper, he invited all of them, whatever church they were from, whatever denomination or whatever sect. He invited all of them to partake of the Lord's Supper. And that did not sit well with the presbytery. And so they called him in before the presbytery, and the charge was that he was preaching a peculiar, strange doctrine, in preaching that all people in the Lord should be able to come together in the Lord's house and at the Lord's table. And part of the punishment was that he was to go out to the pigsty and preach a sermon to the pigs. Well, I think that gives you some idea as to the divisions that existed in church life in the early 1800s. The sectarian spirit was so strong that one group would not have fellowship with another group, even though they might be in the same denomination. They were a part of a different sect, and therefore they would not fellowship together. A traveling Presbyterian preacher stopped at a house to seek lodging for the night, introduced himself as a preacher in the Presbyterian church, which was my father's church and my church. And the man asked him, "What branch of the Presbyterian church are you a member of?" And he said, "I am an anti-burger seceder Presbyterian." And the man said, "There's one of your kind 3 miles down the road," and slammed the door in his face. And Thomas Campbell found that type of conflict among church people most repulsive. Now let's go back to Ireland. I am now 19 years old. My father has gone to America. I have the responsibility, along with my mother, of taking care of brothers and sisters. And that fall, my mother and all of us children were planning to sail to America to rejoin Father, and we did board a ship in the fall of the year in Scotland. But we were not far out at sea until a storm came up, and the ship began to toss in the winds and the waves, and actually began to sink, it seemed, began to go over on its side. And we thought all of us are going to drown right here. But the ship righted itself, and then we were able to sail back into the port. But here we were in Scotland, and we were going to have to stay there for a while. But during the height of that storm, I promised God that if He would spare my life, that I would devote my life to His service. Well, the family was spared. We found lodging. I began to tutor some students to get a little bit of money for the family. We had a meager existence, but we stayed there for a year and a half. But one of the blessings that came out of that shipwreck was that I was able to enroll in the university, Glasgow. That's the same university my father had attended. Some of the professors that he had were still there. And I soon rose to the top of the class. And I was able to teach others, and I was able to make some advancement. And so the professors began to take notice of me, and they even said, there is a young man, as I was leaving the university, there is a young man who is going to change the world in some way. While I was there, I also heard of a group of people called the Haldanes. Now, they were a group of individuals who had broken away from their denomination, and they were meeting just as independent Christians, and they were attempting to restore the New Testament church. And one of the things that they were doing that I found so interesting was that instead of observing the Lord's Supper twice a year, as our custom was, they now were having weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. And those things that they were doing made a lasting impression upon my mind. And they were teaching from the Bible, from the New Testament, the church as revealed in the New Testament, and trying to restore that church. And it was there that I broke with my Presbyterian church and determined to follow a new course. When I came to America, the family was delighted that we were able now to be back with Father, because we had been gone a year and a half, but we were able to get a ship, passage on the ship, and we were able to arrive on the coast and make our way to Pennsylvania. And 350 miles through the mountains we had to travel to where Father was. He knew we were coming, and he was so excited about seeing us after this 2.5 years absence that he started traveling in our direction, and we were traveling in his direction. And so there in the mountains of Pennsylvania we met. And what a happy reunion it was with father and mother and children. But I hated to see my father. And I learned later that my father hated to see me for this reason. We were not the same as we were when we parted 2+ years earlier. He had changed in his thinking about the church, and so had I. He had come to share different beliefs than he had had previously, and so had I. We were separated by an ocean, but we had come to similar conclusions. And so there we met, and we were united, not only physically, but we were united in our thoughts as well. Washington, Pennsylvania was the town where my father had established residence. It was a town of about 500 people. And when we arrived there, for the first 6 months, I didn't do anything except study the Bible. I gave myself totally to a study of the Bible. There was a practice in those days that after the minister would finish his sermon, one of the brothers from the congregation would stand and give an exhortation, helping the people absorb it and make application of what the sermon had been. So when I was 22 years old, my father asked me if I would give the exhortation following his sermon that day. That was in the year of 1810. Later that year, I preached my first sermon. And my text was from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, beginning with verse 24. Wherefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will show you to whom he is likened. He is like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the wind blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, because it was founded upon a rock. And that was the text of my first sermon. The following year, 1811, we established a church in the wilderness. We called it Brush Run. It was there that I was ordained in 1811. It was also there that I was married in the year of 1812. Because you see, when I first arrived in Washington, Pennsylvania, I had the good fortune of meeting the Brown family. Mr. John Brown was a wealthy, prosperous farmer. He had a lovely daughter by the name of Margaret. And we began to date, and after a short courtship, Margaret and I were married. Mr. Brown gave Margaret and me a beautiful farm. Beautiful, highly productive. That was our wedding gift. And so because of the generosity of Mr. Brown's family, that farm was ours. And as I began to apply the skills that I had learned as a boy farming back in Ireland, the farm flourished. I was also able to invent some things that would make farm life a little bit easier on us. And all of this provided a wonderful income for my family and me all of the days of my life. We were blessed abundantly with material things, so that I never had to receive from the congregation any pay for my services, because I was totally self-sufficient in the productive farm life that we enjoyed there in Pennsylvania. What a blessing that was. The time came that our first child was born, and many people have shown an interest in my family and have asked questions about the family. And so I've prepared a few facts about family life that I would like to share with you as I travel through the country. I have people who say, well, do you have children? And where is your wife? And so forth and so on. So here is a brief summary of family life. My first marriage was, as I said, to Margaret Brown. We were married when she was 20 and I was 23. We became the parents of 8 children, 7 girls and 1 little boy. Our little boy died at birth. The 7 little girls continued to live. Margaret became ill and she died of consumption in 1827. And here is the sad thing, and here is the thing that really grieved me deeply, that I followed my first wife and all our children to the cemetery by the time 1851 rolled around. So only 16 years of that marriage lasted, but a total of about 40 years from the time we first met. She was gone, and all the children were gone. They were all buried in the cemetery there near the Campbell mansion at a place called God's Acre. Second marriage. Prior to Margaret's death, she called me to her bedside, and she suggested that since she was passing away, had no hope of living much longer, that she would be pleased if I would marry her dear friend, Selina Bakewell, which I did in 1828. Now, Selena was much younger than I. She was born in 1802, and she was 26, and I was 40 at the time of our marriage. 6 children were born to us, and I witnessed the death of 2 of those children. I must speak about the accidental drowning of our son, Wycliffe. It was in September of 1847, and I was gone on a tour in Scotland and Ireland and England. Wycliffe was a bright child, 10 years old, the fastest learner of any of our children, memorized entire chapters in the Bible by the time he was 10. Child very obedient to his mother and me. And the day of his death, he went swimming with 2 of his, actually they would have been his nephews, older boys from my previous marriage, my grandsons. The 3 of them were swimming in Buffalo Creek, which was not far from the Campbell mansion. They were bathing in the creek. He had asked me about swimming before I departed for my tour in Ireland and England and Scotland, and I said, not during dog days. And he would go to his mother frequently and say, are dog days over? And so finally she said, Wycliffe, dog days are over. You can go swimming. And so he and my 2 grandsons were diving into the water near a mill dam. And Wycliffe became lost beneath the apron of the mill dam. He dove into the water. He came up under that apron. He was bewildered. He could not get out. And so he drowned. The location was near our house, and so cries for help were soon heard and brought a quick response, and every effort known to man was used to try to resuscitate him. Dr. Pendleton came in with bellows to try to inflate his lungs. Hours passed, about 8 hours they tried to revive Wycliffe. And finally he turned to my wife and he said, Sister Campbell, it's fruitless to try further means to revive him. Now, I did not learn of that tragedy for months. Communication was that poor. It was not until I arrived back in Boston in the fall that the message was waiting for me there. And I hastened to our home. And there my wife and I experienced such grief as you could never imagine. Because when I left, Wycliffe was this bright, intelligent child, full of life. The only consolation was to know that he was now with the Lord. Of my 14 children, all but 1 are buried in God's acre, the family cemetery. And here is the thing that grieves me most. I was present for most of those burials. I was there to bury my 2 wives. I was there to bury all of these children, one after the other. Some of them were married. They had families. But they died early. And so as I approach old age, I only have 4 children. 10 of them are with the Lord. I have Alexander Jr., I have William, I have Virginia, and I have Decima. However, my beloved wife, Selena, is still living, taking care of me. But let me go back to where I was a moment ago when I mentioned the birth of our first child. When she was born, people began to say, when are you going to baptize the baby? I said, we're not. You're not going to baptize your baby? No, we're not going to baptize the baby. Well, all of the family, everyone was baptized as a baby. Why are you not going to baptize the baby? Well, being a Greek scholar, I had made a study of scriptures and I found no authority for infant baptism in the New Testament, or in the Bible anyway. About the same time, there were 3 adults in the church came to my father, and they said, we would like to be baptized, immersed. He didn't know how to do it. He took them down to Buffalo Creek, and he led them out into deep water. He didn't lead them out. He told them to march out into that deep water. And they got into water up to their shoulders, right up to their neck. And there was a big tree trunk right here beside of the creek, and they were standing down here. And Father held on to that tree so he wouldn't fall in. And he spoke the words, and he just reached out and put his hand on top of their head and pushed them under. They went under. And you know what? They came up straightway out of the water. So that was our first experience with immersion. Well, this being the case, I now was convinced that I hadn't been scripturally baptized. And so I approached a Baptist preacher by the name of Matthias Luce. And I asked Matthias if he would baptize me. And he said he would. And I said, well, upon this condition, that I be free to preach and teach without being restricted by any creed or any man-made rules. And he said, that's fine with me. And so Matthias Luce baptized me. But here was the surprising thing. The day that we were going to go down to Buffalo Creek for the baptizing, I was there with my clothes ready to go, and here comes Father Campbell walking out of his apartment. And he said, I gave instruction to Mrs. Campbell to provide a change of clothing for me. And he said, and also she prepared a change of clothing for herself. And so my father was immersed, and my mother was immersed, and I was immersed, and my wife was immersed, and my sister Dorothea was immersed, and then another couple from the church were all baptized that day. We had about 30 members of the church at that time, and the following Lord's Day, 13 more of them stepped forward and said, we would like to be baptized too. And so they were immersed, and others followed until every member of the Brush Run Church was an immersed believer. And our position was that individuals should make their own decision for salvation and for baptism. We did not want to start another denomination because we were trying to bring people in the denominations together. So what are we going to do? Well, we were approached in 1813 by the Redstone Association of Baptists, and they invited our little Brush Run Church to become a part of the association. Having this desire not to start another religious body, because we were pleading for the union of the people of God, we accepted that invitation. Again, upon this understanding that we would not be bound by any man-made creed, but we would only be preaching the Bible as we understood it. And so they accepted us on that condition. And we remained either in the Redstone Association or the Whitstone Association until 1830, but eventually we found it necessary to separate from the association. And so from that time, we were known simply as Christians, disciples of Christ, Christian Church, and the legal title being Church of Christ. We were dubbed Campbellites. You've heard that. However, we were known as the Reformers by the Baptists because we were attempting to reform the Baptist Church. We discovered that there were two means of propagating the truth that we wanted to preach. One of them was through the debate. I was of the opinion that more could be accomplished in 1 week of debating than you could do in 1 year of preaching. And so I engaged in several debates during my lifetime. And on this table over here, I have a couple of debate books that were published. This one, the Campbell Rice debate, took place in Lexington. And Henry Clay was the moderator. And Mr. Rice was a Presbyterian, as I had been. And I was now a Christian preacher. And so we were debating the differences between the Presbyterians and the Christians. Also, there is another book here, a debate book on where I debated a Roman Catholic, Mr. Purcell in Cincinnati, debate on the Roman Catholic religion. And so a lot was accomplished through the debates, and many of my debates were printed and are still available in circulation. And that's one of the ways that we had of propagating the message that we were proclaiming. The other was through the printed page. And again, excuse me as I go to the table and show you a couple of, at least one book. The first publication that I did was called The Christian Baptist. And that was done all those years, 1813 to 1830, when we were part of the Redstone Association. But when we broke with the Baptist and could no longer wear that name, it was not appropriate for me to continue to publish my viewpoints under that name of Christian Baptist. And so I began the Millennial Harbinger. There are about 27 volumes of the Millennial Harbinger. And Harbinger was a monthly publication. People would correspond with me. They would ask doctrinal questions, and I would answer those questions in print. And that formed the body of the Millennial Harbinger. And many, many volumes of those are available to be used. I also wrote some songs. And I have a songbook. Unusual songbook. I think I only published one complete book. I wrote a few songs, and I guess the most popular one, although none of them ever made the charts, but it was a song about John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. On the bank of Jordan I stand, it began. It talked about Jesus coming to be baptized, and about the heavens opening, and God saying, "This is my beloved Son," and the Spirit coming down like a dove and lighting upon him. And so I was a songwriter. I was a writer, publisher. I had a print shop. That was part of our livelihood, was from the print shop. And all of these were things that I did in ways that I was able to get the message out to the people. Also, realizing that people needed a good education, I established the Buffalo Seminary in 1818. And then later I dissolved it and developed Bethany College, which was begun in 1841. Now, when I first arrived in America in 1809, I had never heard of Barton Warren Stone. Knew nothing about what had gone on in Kentucky at the Cane Ridge Revival and the outgrowth of that revival under the leadership of Elder Barton Stone. But in time I was invited to speak in Kentucky, and in 1824 I met Elder Stone. We were attracted to each other, and we found that we had many of the same viewpoints. There were some differences, and not all of the differences were resolved. But we were similar enough that we felt that the two groups could come together. And so in 1832, the followers of Stone and my followers, the followers of Stone known as the Christians and my followers known as the Reformers, came together in Lexington, and they merged. There was a union that was created, and our combined group became known as the Campbell Stone Restoration Movement and spread like a forest fire throughout the country. Final word about my father, Thomas Campbell. He wrote a document called the Declaration and Address. And this document set forth the way to promote biblical Christianity and Christian union. And in this declaration, he stated that the Church of Christ is essentially, intentionally, and constitutionally one. He based that upon Paul's writing, that by one Spirit we are all baptized into one body, and that body is Christ. And furthermore, he stated that division among Christians is anti-Christian, anti-scriptural, and he stated that the Bible is our only rule of faith and practice for Christians. Now, you perhaps received a list of the principles of the Restoration Movement. And I will not go through these with any depth this evening, but these are 10 principles that I wrote expressing my understanding of the movement to restore New Testament Christianity. Sufficiency of the sacred scriptures, no book but the Bible. The New Testament contains the will of God concerning our duty in this dispensation of grace. Faith must have Jesus Christ for its object. Faith should not have as object our opinions and speculations, but it's all about Jesus. There should be a "Thus saith the Lord" for every article of faith and item of practice. And on it goes. And these were principles that I felt could be adopted by all followers of Jesus Christ and could bring us together into one united church. Well, we had a number of slogans. You find these printed there also. Where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we're silent. The restoration of primitive Christianity and its doctrine, its ordinances, and its practices. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, love. No book but the Bible. No creed but Christ. No plea but the gospel. And no name but the divine. I want to tell you, before I close, about some of my trips into this part of Kentucky. My travels were extensive, both abroad and throughout America. But I wanted to mention just a few that would be of interest to you. And these are documented in the Millennial Harbingers. As you read through the 27 volumes, you find reference to these that I will mention. The first time that I came to Kentucky was in 1823. I traveled 300 miles on horseback. Some of you will love that. 300 miles on horseback. In 1830, I traveled 1,400 miles in 100 days. And I spent time in Danville, and Liberty, in Columbia, as well as larger cities such as Lexington and Louisville. Probably that 1830 trip was the dedication of Mount Gilead Church.
How many horses did you use during that?
Wow. No idea. 1939, I made a tour of 5,000 miles, traveling by rail, stagecoach, and horseback. 1958, I was in Danville, other parts of Kentucky such as Lexington, Flemingsburg, Mount Sterling. You will notice that I did not mention 1832. The merger between my followers and Stone's followers, I was unable to attend. But Raccoon John Smith represented me. 1862, I made another trip through Kentucky, preaching along the way, and continued on to Nashville, Tennessee, where I preached in the Methodist Episcopal Church to one of the largest audiences that I had ever addressed. Along the way, I was privileged to preach in some of the churches in Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. I was a delegate to the Virginia Constitutional Convention in 1829 and 1830. I enjoyed the company of governors and presidents. President James Madison was of particular interest in my exposition of scriptures, and he gave me a letter as I was traveling to England, introducing me as the most able expounder of scriptures that he had ever listened to in his life. In closing, let me say that I am for peace, and I am for unity of all believers, and I am for harmony in the body of Christ, and I am for the restoration of the New Testament church in name and practice and policy. And may God bless you as you continue to serve the Lord. At this time, I will open this up if you have